He had a drooping lower lip and a stammer that cracked every syllable. Court whispers followed him like shadows. They said a prince should command with his voice, but Gabriel could barely speak. In 1788, smallpox erased his entire family in 1 week. Wife, child, then him. No heirs, no throne, just silence. A bloodline drowned not in war, but in whispers and disease. He was born under marble ceilings and candlelit tapestries, in a palace carved into the granite bones of the Sierra de Guadarrama. El Escorial stood not just as a home, but as a monastery, a tomb, and a mirror of the Spanish soul. And it was here, on the 12th day of May, in the year 1752, that Infante Gabriel first drew breath, his cry soft, uncertain, almost apologetic. The child was royal, but not destined for the throne. His full name was a mouthful even for the court chroniclers: Gabriel Antonio Francisco Javier Juan Nepomuceno José Serafín Pascual Salvador. A name stitched together from saints, kings, and expectations, too large for the small, stammering boy who would grow into it. From the beginning, his blood carried the weight of too much sameness. His father, King Charles III of Spain, was a Bourbon of the Naples line, son of Philip V, himself a grandson of Louis XIV of France. His mother, Maria Amalia of Saxony, came from the deeply interwoven houses of Wettin and Wittelsbach, already marked by consanguineous unions. Their marriage, politically strategic, was also biologically fragile. Both were products of uncles marrying nieces, cousins, wedding cousins, over generations. Gabriel, like so many children of Europe's great dynasties, was an heir not to land, but to genes turned in on themselves. He bore no dramatic deformity. This was not a grotesque case, like some of the Habsburgs whose jaws jutted to caricature. But it was enough. Enough to be noticed in candlelight, enough to be whispered about behind fans and in physicians' notes. His face was long and narrow, with a high protruding brow that gave his features a hollow grandeur. His lips, especially the lower, drooped ever so slightly, soft, sluggish, and sometimes wet when he spoke too fast. His speech was halting, broken at times by what tutors politely described as a mild impediment, though others whispered the word tongue-tied. The palace had many corridors. Gabriel learned to walk them alone. In the hierarchy of princes, Gabriel was neither first nor favored in the public eye. His elder brother Charles, strong of jaw and voice, would become king. Another brother, Antonio Pascual, would serve in military and administrative posts with vigor. But Gabriel, soft-spoken, observant, and slow to warm, remained behind, always behind. His mother died when he was only 9. Maria Amalia, the quiet queen who had borne 14 children and buried most of them, left behind a void not easily filled. Charles III, though a strict and pragmatic monarch, loved his children in a way that was not performative. But even he could not stop the comparisons, the slow divergence of Gabriel from what a Spanish prince was expected to become. He did not command attention. He did not thunder in debates. His voice, when raised in reading or reply, trembled slightly, not from cowardice, but from something in the muscle, in the nerve, in the marrow. And yet he was bright. He showed a precocious memory for scripture and classical languages. Latin came easily to him, as did Italian and French, the tongues of diplomacy and the salon. He was not unintelligent, far from it. He was insightful, introspective, capable of empathy in a court that often regarded emotion as a threat to order. But language, in his own voice, betrayed him. Even as a child, servants were careful when addressing him. Some bent too low, compensating for what they thought he lacked. Others, cruel in their own silence, avoided prolonged exchanges. His siblings teased him occasionally, but even they grew to sense the edges of discomfort that formed around his words. It wasn't the stammer alone, it was how the world leaned back when he leaned in. Spain, by then, had become accustomed to royal oddities. The legacy of the Habsburgs lingered in portraits and protocols. Lips that couldn't close, jaws that jutted, eyes set too near or too far apart. But Gabriel was a Bourbon-Habsburg hybrid, with enough refinement to pass in marble, but not in movement. In painting, he could be made to look regal. In motion, the truth was softer, slower, more fragile. By his teenage years, the whispers had grown legs. "They say he cannot read aloud," a scribe noted in a court margin. "Too much Saxon blood," muttered a physician after a stilted conversation. "Charles breeds stallions, but this colt is quiet," remarked a French ambassador, not knowing the boy had overheard. And still, Gabriel endured. He endured through music, his truest language, and through long walks in the Escorial Gardens, where he would memorize lines of Virgil or Pindar in his mind, never daring to speak them aloud to anyone but the wind. There, among the trimmed hedges and heavy stone saints, he could speak freely to statues who never mocked, to trees who never judged. It is said that those who grow in silence often develop an inner world far richer than those who are praised aloud. Gabriel's world was made of pages, prayers, and piano keys. He did not roar like a lion, but there was still music in his soul, a melody others would never hear. And yet, he was not bitter. The bitterness would come later, with death. For now, in the soft light of his early years, Gabriel was simply a child trying to be enough. Enough for a father who ruled from a throne. Enough for courtiers who listened for clarity and power. Enough for a future that would never arrive. He had all the titles: Infante of Spain, grandeur of the realm, Prince of the Blood. But behind the doors of El Escorial, when candles were snuffed and the winds howled through stone corridors, he was just Gabriel, the boy with the drooping lip and a voice that stammered in the dark. A withered branch, still living, a song half sung. A prince born from too much sameness, into a world that demanded difference. The court of Madrid glittered with conversation. Words were power, tone was currency, and silence, real silence, was not golden, but suspicious. In salons and drawing rooms, the rhythm of a royal's life was set by how well he spoke. A prince had to be eloquent, precise, charming when needed, commanding when required. But what happens to a prince whose voice cannot follow the rhythm of expectation? Gabriel knew from an early age that his words landed differently. They didn't fly across rooms or draw nods from ministers. They hovered awkwardly, half-formed, stumbling over the air like a child tripping in a ballroom. His brothers could recite from memory, debate with bishops, and read aloud with clarity in Mass. He, on the other hand, hesitated. There was always a slight pause before he spoke, a twitch in the lower lip, a quiet intake of breath, then a word, sometimes soft, sometimes warped, sometimes swallowed halfway through. No one ever corrected him, and that was worse. The silence that followed his speech was not the silence of contemplation, but of discomfort. A servant might glance sideways, as if pretending not to notice. A tutor might smile too quickly. A guest from Vienna might nod with a little too much sympathy, as if trying to make the boy feel capable when they had already decided he was not. Official documents from the time barely mention his speech at all. But in private journals, in letters between minor courtiers, one reads between the lines. He was shy, modest, better suited to quiet pursuits. These were not compliments. They were coded acknowledgments that Gabriel was not made for oratory, not destined for courts, assemblies, or warfare. His tongue, they believed, could not carry Spain's future on it. Still, he tried. He attended lessons in rhetoric alongside his brothers. He practiced reading aloud from scripture, his hands sometimes shaking from the strain of willing his lips to move the way they should. He stood in chapel during formal recitations, his voice faint, trembling. But there. When Charles III observed his sons, he was not unkind. He loved Gabriel, that much is certain. But kings measure their children differently than fathers. And in the silence that followed Gabriel's speech, even Charles could not help but compare. In public, Gabriel was often placed at the periphery, never too far to be forgotten, but never centered either. In royal portraits, he stood behind brothers. In processions, he rode quietly, never announcing proclamations. In courtly ceremonies, he bowed deeply, but spoke little. And when he did, those around him held their breath, not out of anticipation, but out of worry, for both his dignity and their own discomfort. When tutors described him in reports, they used phrases like quietly devoted, observant, or emotionally refined. These were the words they used for those who couldn't shine the way a prince was supposed to. Yet Gabriel was not dull, far from it. He was deeply thoughtful, often more perceptive than his louder peers. But his inability to perform royal speech, that sharp, clipped, unwavering delivery expected of men born to power, cost him opportunities, roles, and recognition. He was never called to speak in open court. He was never tasked with public readings during festivals or royal declarations. He was not asked to welcome foreign dignitaries with formal addresses, nor to represent the royal family in theatrical or religious ceremonies that required vocal clarity. And yet, he watched his brothers do these things. He watched as Charles, the future king, read confidently in front of vast crowds. He watched as Antonio Pasquale debated policies in fluent French with envoys from Versailles. He watched the way they stood, without fear, without the tremble in the lip, without the stammer that never quite left him. And though he smiled for them, inwardly he folded himself smaller, like parchment creased again and again until the lines were too many to flatten. Even among servants, he sensed the change. When he gave orders, they hesitated, pretending not to hear. When he called for a text, it arrived late. When he asked a question in his soft, faltering voice, replies came overly formal, as if those below him feared being rude by appearing to understand him too quickly, or not at all. There were moments when the politeness hurt more than scorn would have. At least scorn acknowledges your existence. But politeness, when weaponized, erases you while pretending to celebrate your presence. It treats you as delicate porcelain, admired, protected, and ultimately unused. In the winter of his 16th year, a small incident unfolded that would stay with him. A visiting nobleman asked to hear one of the royal sons recite a portion of Cicero. The task fell, unspokenly, to Charles. He performed it flawlessly, his voice echoing through the vaulted room. Applause followed. Then came the polite suggestion. Perhaps Gabriel would favor them with a few lines? He stood. He opened the scroll, and then nothing. Not because he forgot, not because he hadn't practiced, but because the words, like stones, refused to tumble out. His lip trembled. The scroll shook in his fingers. The silence grew louder than any speech. A cough from the back, a forced chuckle from someone trying to save him. Then a soft voice. "Perhaps another time, Infante." He nodded, sat down, said nothing for the rest of the evening. That was the moment the court stopped asking him to speak, and he never asked them to let him try again. Gabriel began to retreat into corners, not because he feared people, but because he had learned what his presence did to them. He disrupted the flow of things. He reminded them that royalty, too, could falter in the most human of ways. He was not mute. He was not unintelligent. But the court, for all its gold and learning, had no place for a prince who made them uncomfortable. In Spain, heirs must be bold. Princes must speak like gods. And Gabriel, with his soft-spoken efforts and stammered vowels, spoke like a man, a real man, one who bled when mocked, one who shook when watched too closely, one who, instead of roaring, chose silence not out of weakness, but out of dignity. They called him gentle. They called him refined. But they never called him powerful. And in that omission, he was exiled, not to a tower, but to the margins of memory. They gave him tutors instead of companions, while other young royals sparred in courtyards or practiced speeches before visiting envoys. Gabriel was led each morning to a quiet study tucked beneath the stone bones of El Escorial. The windows were narrow, the furniture modest, and the light filtered in through thick curtains like breath through velvet. It was not a prison, but it was far from a stage. Here, the court's embarrassment could be reshaped into virtue. Gabriel would not lead troops. He would not speak in parliament. But he could read the Stoics. He could master the harpsichord. He could be, quietly, excellent. At first, it was a comfort. The silence of the classroom was not judgmental. The books did not smirk. The marble busts of Cicero and Seneca lining the chamber did not flinch when he fumbled a line aloud. And when he failed to speak clearly, the scrolls remained patient. No sideways glances, no hidden smiles, no tutors who said too much with too few words. His father, Charles III, took personal interest in the education of all his sons, and for Gabriel, this meant a different curriculum. Less politics, more philosophy. Fewer orations, more music. He was assigned to study under the composer Antonio Soler, a monk, a mathematician, and one of Spain's finest minds in counterpoint and composition. Soler didn't need Gabriel to speak. He needed him to listen, to feel, to count the silence between notes, the hesitation between chords, the breath between movement and meaning. Gabriel responded not with brilliance, but with devotion. He practiced for hours, hands moving across keys like birds across still water. His posture improved. His fingers grew steady, and though his lips still trembled when he addressed his instructors, it never did when he played. In music, he had no stammer. There is something sacred in the way a quiet person discovers sound, not through voice, but through vibration. The harpsichord became his echo chamber, his voice without words. When he played, even the stone corridors seemed to lean closer. Soler, usually austere, wrote in a letter to a colleague that the prince has more music in his bones than many have in their blood. But music was not his only refuge. Gabriel loved languages, especially those no longer spoken. Latin, Greek, Old Church Slavonic. He studied texts in their original form, painstakingly tracing their grammar, absorbing their structure, speaking aloud only when alone. Unlike the public languages of politics, French, Spanish, Italian, these were languages of the dead, and thus forgiving. Their listeners could not judge. Their meanings were already sealed. When his brothers traveled, Gabriel stayed. When his cousins trained for command, he read. And when his name was omitted from the court bulletins celebrating rising stars and diplomatic favorites, he did not complain. He knew where he stood, somewhere between royalty and shadow, between duty and invisibility, between the golden rooms of public life and the gray halls where forgotten sons were taught not to embarrass. Still, he was not bitter. He wrote letters to his teachers, thanking them for their patience. He sent his brothers books he thought they might like. He practiced calligraphy until each letter was a work of art. If he envied them, he buried it deeper than any archivist could find. And if he dreamed of being more, he did so without ever asking the world to accommodate him. Sometimes visitors came, Austrian nobles, Italian cardinals, French courtiers seeking alliance or favor. They were shown the library, the gardens, the relics of the Escorial chapel. And occasionally, they met Gabriel. He greeted them in polished French or gentle Italian. He bowed with elegance, answered briefly, smiled without overstepping. He was never presented as a future statesman, only as the king's refined, musical son, the one who loved books, the one who stayed behind. They praised him accordingly. A fine boy, cultured, one ambassador wrote, but not made for court life. What they didn't write, but clearly believed, was that a prince without a commanding voice was no prince at all. That even kindness, intelligence, and loyalty could not fill the space left by an absent tongue. In his private hours, Gabriel walked alone in the gardens of El Escorial. He memorized verses from the Psalms, reciting them under his breath, hoping, perhaps, that divine words would align his own. He fed birds, counted petals on crushed flowers, and watched the seasons change, like time slipping through fingers, not strong enough to hold anything permanent. He was 25 before he began to realize that no appointment would come. No governorship, no diplomatic mission, no command of a fortress, nor a ceremonial post abroad, while others were sent to Naples, to Aragon, to the Indies. Gabriel remained within the cloisters of familiarity. His world was bounded not by maps, but by thresholds. His destiny was not to expand the empire, but to shrink quietly within it. El Escorial was both cradle and tomb, and still, he studied. Because it gave him purpose, because to stop would be to disappear completely. He read about princes who failed, about philosophers who found peace in withdrawal, about saints who chose silence over the violence of certainty. He wrote essays no one would publish, composed sonatas no one outside his chamber would hear. His voice was faint, but it was there, in ink, in rhythm, in the spaces between what others said and what he dared not say. In time, even his tutors stopped asking him to speak aloud. Instead, they listened when he played. And that, perhaps, was his salvation. At 33, Gabriel was not expected to marry. Not because he lacked titles or manners. He had both. He was, after all, the favored son of a king, an Infante of Spain, a grandee of the realm. He had lands in name, music in his fingers, and the blessing of every bishop who had ever heard him speak in Latin, even if his Spanish voice cracked in the echo of chapel walls. But marriage required more than lineage. It required presence, charisma, the kind of vitality that could fill a room and promise heirs. Gabriel filled rooms differently, with quiet, with patience, with music rather than momentum. Still, the match was made. In 1785, 2 years before his quiet death, Gabriel was wed to Infanta Mariana Vitória of Portugal, daughter of Queen Maria I and King Pedro III, his cousin by blood and by dynasty. another product of the great Bourbon-Braganza web, that ever-narrowing circle of thrones and genes. It was, on parchment, a respectable union. Royal, strategic, safe. But beneath the diplomatic pleasantries was something more fragile, something painfully human. Two soft-spoken figures bound together, not just by duty or blood, but by temperament. Two delicate creatures walking through a world of marble and iron. She was not loud, nor beautiful in the way queens were painted, but her voice was gentle, her gaze steady. And when she stood beside Gabriel, something curious happened. The silence between them did not feel heavy. It felt shared. Their wedding was modest by royal standards. No parades, no foreign orchestras, just hymns in the chapel, whispered blessings from courtiers, and the occasional raised glass offered more from obligation than joy. Still, there were glimpses of warmth. In a letter now lost but once copied by a Portuguese court scribe, a guest described the couple as uncommonly alike. Two faces with the same solemn kindness, like matching candle flames burning low but bright. That line, buried in correspondence never meant for public memory, may be the most tender portrait history ever gave them. After the ceremony, the pair moved into La Casita del Infante, a villa gifted by Charles III, a delicate neoclassical residence tucked near El Escorial. Smaller than the royal palace, quieter, secluded, but elegant. It was perhaps the only place in all of Spain where Gabriel could live not as an infante, but as a man. The house had pale yellow walls, gardens patterned like prayer rugs, and long corridors that caught afternoon light like a net. Here, there were no thrones, no ambassadors waiting for declarations, no crowded ceremonies to navigate, just rooms filled with books, instruments, and the soft sound of footsteps never rushed. In this quiet, their marriage unfolded. There are few records of their conversations, no declarations of love etched in diaries, no portraits of them embracing in the dramatic fashion favored by dynasties wishing to immortalize affection. But love, as it is lived, is often invisible to history. We know they shared walks, that they dined alone more often than with company, that Mariana sat through his rehearsals, hands folded, never interrupting, that Gabriel, in return, kept her favorite flowers blooming even into autumn, when frost threatened every fragile thing. And then, a child. In the spring of 1786, Mariana gave birth to a son, Pedro Carlos, a Bourbon-Braganza heir, born not to rule, but to inherit the delicate silence of his parents. They held him like a miracle. Though Gabriel's voice remained halting, it is said that he sang to his infant son, lullabies composed in the quiet hours after dusk. Nothing grand, just notes, simple and slow, meant to bridge the space between heart and cradle. For a time, there was peace, the kind that does not announce itself, but settles like dust over a polished floor. Domestic, unremarkable, and real. A small family in a small villa, spared for a moment from the noise of politics, spared, or so it seemed, from the great machinery of history. But peace, in royal houses, is a borrowed thing. Outside the villa, the world stirred. Revolutions hummed in the distance. France grumbled toward collapse. Even within Spain, reforms brewed like storms held at bay by bureaucracy. But in La Casita, all was still, until the wind changed. It began with a cough, no alarm at first. The cold season had been cruel. The servants wore gloves indoors. Mariana kept her child close to the fire. Gabriel, always pale, grew paler. The villa's doctor administered tinctures. Windows were shut, curtains drawn. But still, the fever came. First the child, then the mother, then Gabriel. Smallpox, the silent executioner of the 18th century, had entered their sanctuary, and it would not leave. But that is a story for another part. For now, let us pause at the threshold, with a man who never shouted, and a woman who never fled, and a child not yet old enough to understand why some candles flicker even when the wind is still. This was not a royal love story made for plays. It had no scandal, no fanfare, no treaties signed in its name, but it had gentleness. Two soft voices meeting in the half-light. And sometimes, that is more tragic than any war, because it is so easily forgotten. They lived together for 3 years, and in that time, neither ever raised their voice. The villa was too quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of shared routine, of footsteps echoing softly on marble, of pages turning in unison by candlelight. This was a silence that pulsed, dense, uneasy, the kind that crept in through closed doors and hovered behind every breath. It began without ceremony. A servant, coughing in the morning air, a touch of fever dismissed as exhaustion. Then a red mark. Another. The physician was summoned, his expression tight. He said nothing as he left the room, but returned with urgency in his stride and vinegar on his gloves. By the time the word was spoken aloud, viruela, it was too late. Smallpox. The plague that had already torn through towns and palaces, that had carved holes in noble lines and peasant cribs alike, had come to La Casita del Infante. It slipped past the painted gates and ornamental hedges. It passed through lace curtains and embroidered linens. It did not care for titles. It did not care for silence. It struck the child first. Pedro Carlos, the small miracle born of quiet love. Barely 2 years old, his cheeks flushed, his limbs restless. He cried, not in sharp bursts, but in soft moans that faded too quickly. His skin blistered, his breath grew thin. Gabriel refused to leave his side. He sat beside the crib, whispering prayers he had memorized in Latin as a child, his voice cracking, not from speech impediment this time, but from fear. He tried to sing, but his throat closed. His fingers trembled when he reached for water. The harpsichord in the next room remained untouched, its keys gathering dust as silence took hold. Mariana stood at the door, unable to speak, one hand pressed over her mouth as if she could hold in her grief, hold it in like breath. But grief is not breath. It leaks, it seeps, it breaks through, slow and ruinous. 3 days. That was all the child had. 3 days of fighting before his small lungs gave out. He died at dawn, his father's fingers wrapped around his limp wrist, lips moving though no sound came. Gabriel did not weep then, not aloud. He simply sat still as if waiting for something, a miracle, a mistake, a reversal of fate. But fate, once delivered, does not take returns. The body was taken quietly. No royal guards, no formal mourning, just a white cloth and a servant who bowed his head so deeply he nearly touched the floor. Mariana followed the next night. Her fever had burned slowly, deceptively. She had tended to the child in his final hours and hid her own symptoms until it was too late to conceal. By the time the rash bloomed across her chest, she was already shaking. Her voice, which had once comforted Gabriel in the stillness of evening, was reduced to groans of pain and half prayers. Her final hours were delirious. She spoke of the garden, of Gabriel's music, of a white dress she had once worn that no one else seemed to remember. Gabriel sat beside her bed as he had sat beside their child. He held her hand and whispered what words he could. Sometimes he said her name. Sometimes he didn't speak at all. There are records, sparse, clinical, of her death. But no letters, no final notes. Just the physician's ledger. Infanta Mariana Vittoria, expired night of November 21st, 1788. 2 days, mother and son, both gone. Gabriel, already fragile in health, did not escape. The fever came for him last. His attendants tried to move him to another room. He refused. This was his home. These were his halls. And if death had chosen this place, then let it be finished here. By the evening of November 22nd, his lips were blistered. His skin burned to the touch. His vision blurred. He could not walk, could barely speak. But he tried. He tried to summon priests. But the words caught in his throat. He tried to write a letter to his father. But his hand failed him halfway down the page. His final night was spent alone. Not because no one loved him, but because no one dared stay. The disease was unforgiving. They say he died just before sunrise, on November 23rd, 1788, in the very room where his child had drawn his last breath. The same curtains, the same stale air, the same bed sheets, now stained by a second prince's departure. 3 lives, 1 week. A single house emptied of its purpose. There was no procession, no thundering drums, no black banners flying over Madrid. Only the low tolling of the monastery bell and the hurried whisper of servants washing down walls with vinegar and ash. The bodies were placed in simple coffins, sealed quickly, and sent to El Escorial for burial. Not in state, not in splendor, but in quiet urgency, as if the very memory of them carried contagion. By the end of the month, King Charles III himself would be dead. Not of smallpox, but of age and grief, his lungs weakened, his spirit broken. It was as if November had decided to erase them all, not with fury, but with precision. A line of royal blood, snuffed out without noise. A father, a mother, a child, a villa now hollow, and a silence that could no longer be shared. When the fever took hold of Gabriel, it came not like a wave, but like a closing door. Quiet at first, barely noticeable until the air on the other side disappeared. His skin flushed with heat, but his body trembled as though winter had crept into his blood. His vision blurred, and his once deliberate hands began to twitch with confusion. At first, he insisted it was exhaustion. Grief, he whispered. That was all. But everyone knew. He had buried his wife. He had buried his son. Now death had returned for him, not as a thief in the night, but as a shadow that no longer waited to be invited. There was no procession of doctors, no flurry of consultation between royal physicians. The moment the word smallpox was spoken, the household shrank into silence. Few dared enter his chamber. Fewer still remained for long. The disease was unforgiving, visible, terrifying, and merciless. His lips, once only slightly drooping, were now cracked and blistered. The soft tremble that once made his voice human now made it incoherent. Speech was reduced to syllables, then to murmurs, then to breath. Even that grew scarce. On the first night, he tried to sit at the harpsichord. They found him slumped before it at dawn, forehead resting on the keys, the faint imprint of ivory carved into his skin. He hadn't played a note. He hadn't even opened the lid. It was not just his body that had failed. It was his voice, his memory, his music. The next day, he attempted to write. A letter to his brother, perhaps, or his father, or maybe to no one at all. The ink dried at the edge of his page. His name was the only word he finished: Gabriel. The rest trailed off into loops, a line like a quiet scream without end. He slept often, but never peacefully. His dreams were fevered. He murmured names, phrases in Latin, bits of songs he had once played for Mariana on soft spring evenings when the garden had not yet withered. The servants outside his room said they heard him crying once. Not from pain, but from remembering. The blisters came next, across his face, his arms, his chest. The marks of nobility stripped bare by a disease that cared nothing for birthright. He was no longer an Infante. He was simply a man, burning from the inside out, reduced to a suffering body in a darkened room. No royal physician dared risk their own life to comfort him in those final hours. Instead, an old servant stayed. A man who had cared for him as a child, once brushed his hair before state dinners, once whispered, "You're doing fine, my lord," when the boy had stammered too long over a psalm. That man now knelt by the bedside and held a cloth to Gabriel's forehead, changing it every hour, even when the Infante no longer recognized him. The final day was not dramatic. No loud gasps, no thunder, just the slow unraveling of someone who had never demanded to be seen. His breath grew shallow. His fingers clenched into the bedsheets. His eyes opened once and did not close again. There are no eyewitness accounts of his death beyond what the court physician scribbled later in his own ledger. 23 November 1788. El S.A.R. Don Gabriel, Infante de España, falleció tras 5 días de viruela grave, sin voz, sin testamento, sin misa real. His Royal Highness Don Gabriel, Infante of Spain, died after 5 days of severe smallpox. No voice, no will, no royal mass. No royal mourning period was declared. Spain, already strained by the looming illness of Charles III and the rising tides of unrest beyond its borders, moved on. Ministers turned their attention to matters of succession. Courtiers whispered condolences, but not loudly. There were no poets summoned, no marble tomb designed, just a carriage bearing a sealed coffin to El Escorial, where it joined others, indistinguishable, unnamed among the crypts of louder kings. The palace never reopened the Casita del Infante. For weeks, the villa remained shuttered, its windows dark, its rooms untouched, music sheets left to curl under the weight of time. Mariana's favorite flowers, once replanted each spring, withered and died. No one pruned them, no one dared return. The king, Charles III, followed his son into death less than a month later, though not by smallpox. His breath had become labored in the final weeks of November. His limbs ached. Some said it was age. Others called it heartbreak. In truth, perhaps it was silence. Gabriel's death had not caused an uproar, but in his father's heart, something had gone still. A quiet sun, now forever quiet, a music that would never return, a line of blood that ended not with treason, nor scandal, nor sin, but with fever and soft skin blistering in candlelight. Even in death, Gabriel remained peripheral. His name was recited briefly during the royal year's end mass, tucked between longer praises of saints and foreign allies. The choir did not sing his compositions, his patronage of music, his mastery of Latin, his quiet love for books. None of it was mentioned. He was gone. 3 days, 3 lives. One line of dissent erased as if it had never mattered. A voice once trembled into whispers, now silenced completely, not by fate but by a virus that never knew his name. There are bloodlines that stretch across history like banners, loud, waving, impossible to ignore. And then there are those that fold quietly into the earth, leaving behind only dust and half-remembered names. Gabriel's was the second kind. After his burial, there were no royal proclamations mourning the loss of his house. No commemorative statues erected in the gardens of Madrid. No bells tolled for his extinguished line beyond the monastery walls. Within days, life at court resumed, as if nothing, no one, had been lost. He had no surviving heir, no daughter to marry into foreign nobility, no son to raise a standard, no descendant to say his name aloud. His family died with him, and the silence that had shadowed him in life became permanent. For a brief moment, some among the court mourned, not for the man, but for the opportunity lost. There had been talk once that Gabriel might be sent to Naples, or perhaps govern a distant region of the empire. He was discreet, gentle, obedient. The kind of prince who didn't stir controversy, who would carry out orders with care and not ambition. He would have made a perfect provincial figurehead, a Bourbon who kept order without demanding attention. But smallpox does not negotiate with dynastic plans. And the Spanish court, never sentimental, simply crossed his name from the list and looked elsewhere. The Bourbon dynasty continued. Its louder sons, stronger, more forceful in tone and posture, stepped forward. Charles IV inherited the throne just weeks after Gabriel's death, his reign ushering in an era that would fracture beneath the weight of revolution and incompetence. Infante Antonio Pascual, another brother, would take on ceremonial duties, offering his voice where Gabriel never could. And Gabriel? He was folded away like old parchment. Even in art, he faded. Where other princes appeared in grand oil paintings, mounted on horses, wielding swords, framed in golden arches, Gabriel appeared in the margins. In group portraits, he is the figure at the edge, gaze lowered, hands folded. No painter tried to dramatize his presence. No allegories of virtue or power were assigned to him. The few portraits that exist are subdued, neither flattering nor cruel, just formal. As if the artist, like history, did not know quite what to do with him. At El Escorial, his tomb lies among other royals. But you must know where to look. There is no great inscription, no elaborate effigy, only his name, chiseled into stone with the same lack of ceremony that followed him through life. Casita del Infante, the villa where he lived, still stands. Today, it is a museum, visited by schoolchildren, art historians, and tourists searching for traces of Spanish neoclassicism. Few pause to read the plaque beside the doorway. Fewer still realize that within those walls, an entire royal line ended in a matter of days. The rooms have been restored, the gardens trimmed, but the air, for those who listen closely, still carries a stillness, as if the silence he left behind has soaked into the bricks. A few archivists remember him. Musicians who study Luigi Boccherini sometimes mention his name, for Gabriel had once been the patron of the great composer. It was Gabriel's sponsorship that enabled Boccherini to remain in Spain and compose some of his most intimate works. And for that, in footnotes and liner notes, the Infante is occasionally thanked. But it is a quiet gratitude. A name passed through the mouth quickly, as though its syllables were fragile and best not held too long. His line was not exiled. It was not disgraced. It simply ended. No treason, no assassination, no scandal to preserve in memory or to immortalize in ballads, only a prince who died of disease. A prince whose wife and son died days before him. A prince who, for all his blood and pedigree, left behind no child, no crown, no echo strong enough to stir the future. And in the royal courts of Europe, legacy is everything. To be forgotten is worse than to be hated, because hatred is a kind of memory. But silence is erasure. No streets bear his name, no city square boasts his statue, no cathedral sings his requiem. His death was absorbed into the record books without fuss. His life edited down to a footnote. Even his music, the one thing that made him momentarily visible, was overshadowed by the composer he supported. The melodies survived. The man who made them possible did not. And so, the bloodline that might have been, the family that might have flourished in peace, the prince who might have governed a corner of Spain in quiet dignity, all of it disappeared beneath the weight of what was never allowed to become. History has no mercy for those who do not leave loud footprints. Gabriel's were soft, too soft. He was never meant to command armies or rewrite laws. His voice lacked the force for declarations. His posture never quite suggested authority. But in one realm, unseen, unthreatening, and intimate, he left behind something that breathed longer than titles. He left music, not composed with his own hand, but made possible through his quiet presence, his attentive ear, his patronage. In the dimly lit halls of La Casita del Infante, among rosewood instruments and parchment scores, Gabriel gave sanctuary to notes that would outlive him. And at the heart of that legacy was a name barely whispered in court, but resonant in music halls across Europe: Luigi Boccherini. An Italian by birth, Boccherini had come to Spain in search of favor, stability, and an audience. In the courts of Madrid, he had found admiration, but not a home, until Gabriel opened his doors. The prince, soft-spoken and withdrawn from courtly ambition, saw in Boccherini what few others did: not just talent, but soul. They met not as monarch and subject, but as kindred spirits. Gabriel did not demand compositions for spectacle. He did not commission operas to dazzle visiting dignitaries. Instead, he requested intimate pieces, chamber works, music meant for reflection, for grief, for rooms that held only a few chairs and no applause. He preferred the cello to the trumpet, the quartet to the orchestra, the silence between notes more than the crescendo. It was Gabriel who gave Boccherini a permanent post, a salary, and above all, a listener. And from this quiet collaboration emerged some of Boccherini's most delicate masterpieces. Quintets that sway like candlelight, nocturnes that drift like prayers, adagios heavy with sorrow yet strangely clean, like air after rain. Musicologists today still study these works. They marvel at their restraint, their poise, their melancholy. What few of them mention, however, is the environment that birthed them. A villa of subdued voices, a prince who never interrupted, and a world so still that even the softest chords had room to grow. Boccherini once described Gabriel as un uomo di grande tatto, a man of great sensitivity. It was not flattery, it was observation. He recognized, perhaps better than anyone, that Gabriel's silences were not emptiness, but shelter. Under the Infante's patronage, Boccherini created music that did not roar. It whispered, it consoled, it mourned. It reflected the man who had paid for it. None of the scores bore Gabriel's name in grand dedication. He never demanded it. He had no interest in memorials. But in their tempo, in the solemn sway of each phrase, one hears the outline of his soul. Even today, if you sit with Boccherini's Fandango or his Stabat Mater, there are moments, brief, almost imperceptible, when the music does not seek to impress, but to comfort. It is in those moments that Gabriel still speaks. He did not need lyrics. He had already said everything in the way he listened. There are accounts, faint and buried in private letters, of Gabriel playing harpsichord deep into the night. Not for an audience, not for praise, simply to fill the silence of rooms that had too many memories and too little laughter. Servants would pause outside the door, not daring to enter. They said the prince played with care, not mastery. Each key pressed as if asking permission, not demanding attention. Sometimes, they claimed, he would stop mid-piece, not out of mistake, but reflection, as if he had remembered something too beautiful or too painful to continue. After his death, the instruments were stored. The harpsichord sat silent for years. The villa became a shell of its former self. Its rooms dusted weekly, but walked rarely. No other prince took residence. No other fingers played those keys. The music, like the man who once sheltered it, was left to sleep. And yet, it did not die. Boccherini survived him. For a time, he composed for others. He moved, he struggled. But the music made for Gabriel remained his most delicate work, the part of his legacy untouched by royal demands or market trends. Centuries later, as scholars pieced together Boccherini's catalog, they found themselves returning to these pieces, not for grandeur, but for grace. Some now call it the Gabriel cycle, a soft collection, a conversation between a composer and a prince who never raised his voice, a eulogy in notes, a diary without words. It is a rare thing in history, a royal whose greatest influence came not from command, but from stillness. Gabriel's music did not carry his name through time as an emperor's conquests might, but it did something gentler, perhaps nobler. It allowed those who came after him to feel what he once felt: solitude, longing, the beauty of restraint, the sound of a voice that trembles but does not break. They say music is the soul speaking when words fail. Gabriel understood that. He lived it. He died by it. And through it, he remained. Names are meant to be remembered. That is what royalty is promised, what generations of kings and queens cling to. That the world will not forget them, that stone and ink will preserve what flesh and breath cannot. But the name Infante Gabriel of Spain was never carved deep into memory. It was penciled lightly on the margins of history, so faint that time needed no eraser to wipe it away. You will not find statues of him in Madrid, no bronze figure mounted on a horse, no equestrian silhouette pointing toward battle, no hand outstretched over law books, just absence. The places that once held him, his music, his breath, his silence, now carry on without him. Casita del Infante still stands, its walls restored, its gardens trimmed, its story retold by museum guides who mention architecture and royal patronage, but rarely pause to say what truly happened there. That it was the stage of a slow erasure. That it was once a cradle for a forgotten line, swept away by disease and silence. Even El Escorial, that solemn necropolis of Spanish kings, does not offer much. He lies beneath its stones, alongside monarchs and martyrs. But his tomb is modest. No carved angels, no weeping cherubs, no inscriptions extolling his virtues. His name appears on a plaque in cold Latin, indistinguishable from others. The burial of an infante, yes, but not of a legacy. Just another sealed vault beneath a corridor of echoes. He left no heirs. That, more than his voice, was what damned his memory. No child to carry the name, no descendant to whisper his story at family gatherings, no line of succession where his blood might surface again. Royal history thrives on continuation. Gabriel's line ended in a week, erased not by rebellion or exile, but by illness and timing. And because no one needed to remember him, because the crown moved forward without hesitation, no one did. It's not that he was disgraced. He wasn't banished, shamed, or erased deliberately. It was more subtle than that. He simply faded, slipped between the cracks. The court never paused to enshrine his virtues. Historians, pressed for space, skipped his name between the lines of Charles III and Charles IV. Artists moved on. Priests forgot his mass. Even Boccherini, in time, composed for others. And yet, his absence remains palpable. In family trees, there's a gap, a branch that extends briefly, then breaks. Those who study Bourbon genealogy notice it, not because it is loud, but because it is unnervingly silent. A perfect void where a small dynasty could have formed, where a new court might have flourished, where music and kindness might have taken root. But all of that died in a villa no larger than a city square. To walk through Casita del Infante today is to walk through rooms that once held a family in quiet dignity. The walls do not speak, but the silence is too clean, too precise, like a polished table that once bore a coffin. If you stop and close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The soft tread of a servant's shoes, the rustle of a music sheet, the hushed cough of a sick child behind the door. There are no memorials, not in the gardens, not in the corridors, not in the chapel. No plaques read, "Here died a Prince Joachim Prince, his wife, and his child," all within days of each other, because that would require acknowledgement, and acknowledgement is the first step toward grief. But no one grieved for long. The court moved on. Charles III died weeks later. Charles IV took the throne. The French Revolution crept closer. Ministers shuffled papers. War loomed. Spain braced for storms, and Gabriel, his voice, his hands, his name, was folded into the past like linen no longer needed. What does it mean to vanish without scandal? Not to fall in battle? Not to die of poison or betrayal? Not to spark a war or inspire a painting? But to simply disappear. To die the way Gabriel died. Quietly. Respectfully. Without legacy. He was not cruel enough to be remembered. Not brilliant enough to be celebrated. Not loud enough to haunt. And so he slipped from memory without resistance. But sometimes, in footnotes, in the acknowledgments of music historians, in the corners of dusty archives, his name flickers. Infante Gabriel, patron of Boccherini, son of Charles III, died of smallpox, 1788. That is all. No monuments, no myths, just a life recorded in facts, untouched by embellishment, unrescued by legend. And yet perhaps the greater tragedy is not that he was forgotten, but that he never demanded to be remembered. He wasn't made of stone or sword. He didn't leave behind conquests, revolts, or declarations that cracked the world in two. He didn't build empires or tear them down. He didn't speak loudly enough for the world to stop and listen. And yet, he existed, fully, painfully, beautifully. Infante Gabriel of Spain. A name most people never learn, a voice few ever heard. A man born into gold-embroidered silence, who died beneath the same velvet hush that shadowed him his entire life. History doesn't know what to do with men like him. The chroniclers like their princes bold, decisive. Their stories lined with war, betrayal, passion, scandal. They search for echoes of thunder. But Gabriel was not thunder. He was a whisper, a breath in a chapel, a note in a harpsichord song fading just before the final chord. He was by every measure of his time, too soft. And maybe that's the part that haunts me most. Not his death, but his gentleness. A gentleness that had no place in the machinery of monarchy. A kindness that could not protect him. A quiet dignity so fragile that the world never bothered to crush it. It simply turned away. He wasn't incompetent. He wasn't foolish. He wasn't weak. He was gentle in a system that punished quiet men. A system that asked its sons to roar when all he ever wanted was to listen. They say he spoke with hesitation, that his lip trembled, that his voice cracked under pressure. But I wonder, what did they miss while staring at his mouth? What did he say with his music? What did he offer in those long, still conversations with Boccherini? In the way he treated servants like people instead of furniture? In the hours he spent reading when no one was watching? There is something noble in restraint. There is something courageous in simply enduring, day after day, when you know you are not what they wanted you to be, but you refuse to become bitter. He didn't rebel. He didn't collapse into resentment. He just kept playing, kept studying, kept loving his quiet corner of the world until the illness came and took it all away. And now, no one speaks his name. It has no gravity in the mouths of school children. It appears on no banners. It echoes in no grand rotundas. Even in death, his silence continues. Thick, soft, polite, tragic. But I remember him. And maybe that's enough. Maybe stories like his were never meant for monuments. Maybe they are meant for quiet corners of thought. For those of us who wonder what happens to people who never got to become what they could have been. Not because they failed, but because the world had no room for them. Infante Gabriel was a prince, but not the kind we're told to admire. He was the kind that history forgets, and that humanity, if it's wise, should not. Because for every king crowned, there's a brother behind the curtain. For every war waged, a hand that refused to lift the sword. And for every anthem sung, there's a quiet melody, soft, half lost, that still lingers in the walls of a villa once filled with tenderness, now empty. So I leave you with this. How many heirs have died, not by poison, not by dagger, not even by plague, but by silence? How many men were erased, not because they were dangerous, but because they were gentle? And if we cannot remember them, who then are we really choosing to be?